If a relationship is healthy or good, does it mean that there really shouldn't be challenges or that it shouldn't be hard? Let's talk about it. Welcome, I'm Peggy Oliveira. Thank you for joining me. I'm doing this video because I stitched a video on TikTok in which somebody asked the question about why it is we have this idea that marriage is hard. And she shared some of her experience and why she kind of thinks that it doesn't necessarily have to be or isn't. And I think there's a lot of things that go into relationships generally that are important to really recognize. And I think for people that have experienced childhood trauma, which is what probably most of you can relate to, being able to recognize the health of a relationship, being able to create realistic expectations, being able to understand ourselves in relationships, all of that is really important. So I'm going to share some things that I think are just maybe helpful to know. The first is something that you've heard me say probably many times. We are all wounded. And as a result, we take those wounds into any relationship we have, whether it's a friendship that is not necessarily really close, or certainly a romantic, intimate relationship, certainly family relationships, all relationships, we bring ourselves into them, right? And part of ourselves is the wounding that we've experienced and the impact that it's created. So what I ended up saying in the stitched video is that I do believe that marriages in particular can be hard. Part of it might depend on how you define hard, but they are definitely work. And in any long-term relationship, I think there are going to be times that are hard. Now, if it's an unhealthy relationship, it's likely going to be hard all the time. And that's kind of a little bit of a different thing that I want to get into today. So being able to recognize that within our close relationships, so this can happen certainly in a friendship too, but I'm talking more specifically about romantic, intimate relationships because that is where in our adult lives, generally speaking, we are most vulnerable. And because of that vulnerability, it can create more challenges within the relationship, more opportunity for challenges within the relationship. So each of us is wounded. We come into the relationship with those wounds, with the ways that it impacts us, how it causes us to show up in our lives, how we respond to difficulty, how we cope, even kind of what we want out of a relationship, even if we're not conscious of what it is that we want, or it might be different than what we think we want. So every one of us comes into a relationship from that place. Most people are unaware of what their wounding is. Even for those that may have a sense of what their wounding is, often don't necessarily have a really good sense of what that means in their relationship. So how it shows up, how they choose to show up, how it affects arguments, disagreements, how it affects what helps them feel connected and accepted and those kinds of things. So when we don't have an awareness of that, a real understanding of that, it's naturally going to create some challenges within the relationship because everybody has different needs. Some of those needs can overlap for sure, but they're not always going to be the same. And sometimes, even for a healthy relationship, what one person needs in a relationship might look different than what somebody else needs in that relationship. Doesn't mean it can't work. It does mean it's going to be really hard if you're not aware of what those needs are and you cannot express them. Or maybe you can't express it, but your partner is so self-protective that they can't really hear it without taking it personally and getting defensive. That's going to create some challenges as well. Now, I want to be clear, that doesn't mean it's a bad relationship. It doesn't mean that the relationship can't work, but it is going to take work to make it work. And it will take work on both people's part. So, I think that there are a couple of things that a lot of people can kind of relate to. So I'm going to give a couple of examples. One that I think we've all at least heard of, even if we haven't experienced it ourselves, is the idea of somebody leaving things laying around, like socks or dirty clothes. And the other person gets angry about it all the time and is always like complaining or nagging about it. And the person who leaves their stuff laying around doesn't get it. So in a situation like that, often what is happening is that obviously isn't important to the person who's doing it, who's leaving stuff lying around. But for the other person, it means something to them. And it could be in part that they're just a really tidy person and they don't like things laying around. Now, I will say, as a little bit of a side note, if there are things like that that really, really bother you, that like really have an impact on how you're able to feel and navigate your day and really affect like how your nervous system feels, it's not that there isn't something to work on in the relationship, but honestly, I think that anything, no matter what it is, if you have a really strong reaction like that, there might be something that you can do that might be helpful to kind of process and understand what that's about so that you can work on that a little bit. But that doesn't mean that if your partner continues to leave stuff lying around, that you're wrong for being bothered by it. But let's get back to kind of the main point of this. So when that really bothers you, generally speaking, it's not specifically because the socks are on the floor or the clothes are on the floor. It's because of what it means to you that this person continues to leave their stuff on the floor when they know that it bothers you. So basically, we take it personally and we attach meaning to it. Well, if they're continuing to do this, they know it bothers me. That means they don't care how I feel. Therefore, they must not care about me. And depending on what you believe about yourself, therefore, this proves that I am unworthy or undeserving of love, right? So, and that can bring up a lot of shame. So somebody leaves their socks on the floor, you might say something to them because of their own stuff. They might get defensive about it, feel like you are nagging when you may not at all be nagging, but they might take it that way because maybe they feel bad that they're doing something that you're unhappy with them about. So they get upset about it, get defensive about it, and then you take that even more so to mean all of those other things. And that creates problems. That tends to happen mostly when we're really unaware of what's happening in that dynamic. Because then we're just left with how we feel and the meaning we've attached to it, and we believe that to be the reality. And over time, of course, that's going to create difficulty within your relationship, likely on both sides. Another example is like if people have different ideas or even values about money. And this isn't about right or wrong, but let's say one person wants to live in the present and they know that tomorrow is not guaranteed and they want you to enjoy your life and take trips and do the things and enjoy your life. And so saving for down the road is not really a priority for them. What feels like a priority is living your life together now and enjoying every possible moment. For the other person, for whatever reason, they may feel like we have our whole lives ahead of us and we need to make sure that we're in a position to enjoy our later years when we can retire and do all the things that we want to do. We need to make sure that we have the financial resources and stability to be able to do that. So that person likes to not go out as much, not take extravagant vacations, maybe just do a staycation, maybe a little bit more money conscious. Again, right? Not right or wrong, just very different ideas. And those ideas can even create the sense of kind of fear and or safety. For this person, you're creating a safety net so that you don't have to worry as much down the road. For this person, it's about fearing missing out on something because we may not be here tomorrow. And that fear can be pretty deep-seated, way beyond just not being here tomorrow. And the same even with providing for the future. Like that can definitely be coming from some sort of wound early in life. And it doesn't even have to be about money wound specifically. But when you have different ideas about that, and this person is coming home with an unexpected item, and they're excited about it, and you're feeling like, oh my God, that wasn't part of the plan. That wasn't in the budget for this week. How much did you spend on that? Did you really need that? Well, this person is likely going to feel maybe like they're being controlled, maybe deflated. They were really happy about it. They got a good deal. And then suddenly it crashes to the ground. Where this person, the person's coming in with something new and you're freaking out because you didn't budget for that. And what is that going to mean for this unexpected bill that might come in the mail or whatever? And so then you kind of get a little bit panicky. So on either side, again, not right or wrong, right? And that's really important to recognize. One is not right or wrong. Neither is right or wrong. But when your sense of safety, your sense of connection kind of stems, or that is a part, the financial aspect is a part of that, then it becomes a little bit deeper. It's more than just about the money. It's about life. It's about being able to live longer and healthier and happier and not wanting to put off living our life and being happy and doing things we enjoy for something that may or may not come down the road. So it's different ideas. But when you then meet in that place where this person is coming home with this thing, you're both responding to that, right? And again, if you're unaware of how it feels personal or what meaning you're attaching to the other person's behavior or response, you're going to become reactive in some way. Now, that reactionary response could be completely shutting down and wanting to leave. It could be figuring it out and coming up with a plan. But again, very different ideas. Again, not wrong or right. But it's going to create some problems, some tension in that relationship. The more unaware you are of how that is presenting itself, the more problems it's going to create. So the more self-awareness you have, I think just generally across the board is good. But when you have awareness of how your wounding shows up, when you have an awareness of what really matters to you and what's important to you and why it's important to you, then you can convey that easier to the other person. And all of us, I think, in relationships can probably improve upon that because we're really not taught much at all about relationships, at least not good things about relationships. So we're kind of doing it all by trial and error. And because relationships, our adult romantic relationships, are our most vulnerable relationships, it's just kind of this automatic place where things can very easily show up. Really difficult things can show up. So if you have an awareness of both of these things, you can then have a conversation from a more grounded place where you're not going to be as reactionary. You can have this conversation from a more grounded place to understand one another, and that it's not that the person doesn't care about what you think, they just happen to think differently. Again, not wrong or right, and that's a really important thing. It's just different. And in relationship, there's going to be a lot that you have to compromise on. Sometimes it's really small things like what to have for dinner. Sometimes it's really big things like finding the balance between enjoying your life day to day and being able to enjoy your life later on down the road. There's going to have to be some compromise there. And that's where the work comes in. And certainly the other part is the hard part. It can be really hard. But even working through it can be hard, partly because of the emotional aspect of it, but even finding the way to compromise can be work, and it can be challenging at times. You may feel like you're giving more than the other person. And in all reality, in some things in your marriage or your relationship, you will give more. And in other areas, your partner is going to give more. And so you've heard me talk about this in relationships kind of generally, and I think more so even in friendships, that in any meaningful relationship, there's going to be give and take. There's going to be times when one person maybe is giving more than the other. But over time, that should balance out. So another time, the other person is going to give a little bit more in the relationship. But when you look at the relationship overall, it's balanced. And the same is true in marriage, and certainly when it comes to compromising. One person should not be doing all the compromising under any circumstance. There are times that sometimes things are really, really important to one person, but they're not necessarily that important to the other person, though it might still feel like you have a very strong desire or opinion about it. Well, if it's something that's really, really important to this other person, maybe you can compromise a little bit more because it's not that significantly important to you, but it might create some things for the other person. So an example of this might be somebody who maybe has experienced trauma and feels really uncomfortable in maybe a particular kind of situation. And maybe the partner enjoys those types of situations. So you can find compromise in a couple of different ways. Instead of the person who really likes those types of situations trying to pressure or guilt or even shame the other person to go do it, maybe they recognize that, okay, this person just really is uncomfortable in this situation. And I'm sorry, I'm not really able to think of a particular type of situation where that might be the case. I'm thinking of like a social setting of some sort. But maybe part of the compromise is that if you're the one who really doesn't like it, you recognize that because you don't like it doesn't mean that your partner is wrong for liking it and wanting it. And so maybe part of the compromise is that your partner can go to those things, you're comfortable with them going to those things on their own without you. Maybe part of the compromise is for your partner, the partner that does enjoy those things, that you don't pressure your partner, but you maybe let them know that there's something going on that you'd really like to be able to go to. And are they okay with that? And then you go on your own. Maybe there's other types of situations, maybe even social situations, that your partner is more okay with going, but other ones where they're not. This can come up actually sometimes in navigating family dynamics. Like for one person, family, like the idea of family might be really, really important. For the other person, because of their family growing up, they're maybe not as comfortable. Maybe they have a lot more fear around bad things happening in a family, even if it's like an argument or something like that. And so they want to avoid it, even with your family, for example. So being able to kind of recognize that, and I think being able to find some compromise in that in some way can be helpful. But if you're the only person compromising, that's not a healthy situation because there needs to be overall balance. Now, I want to be clear, it doesn't mean that there needs to be overall balance in every type of circumstance or every struggle within your relationship, but overall within the relationship, There needs to be some balance. So something that just came to mind where I think this might seem extreme, but I think it just makes it a little bit more easy to be obvious about it. So for example, one person might be more open to an open marriage, maybe curious about it. The other person, for any number of reasons, maybe not having anything to do with any sort of wounding or trauma, is not open to it. Well, obviously, you need to have a conversation about that, right? And if one person's not open to it, one person is, you need to find a way to navigate that. And if the person isn't willing to say, no, I'm fine not having an open marriage, then this other person then needs to make a decision about what that means for them. Maybe they need to end the relationship. Now, I know that again, is kind of an extreme example, but is there compromise there? And I think in some circumstances, compromise is not something that can be had. And I think that might be one of those circumstances. Another one potentially is the choice to have children or not. That might not be something that you compromise on. Now, ideally, people would have that conversation before they commit to a long-term relationship. But if not, or maybe if somebody changes their mind, because that can certainly happen, that's an area where compromising might not work. Because that's a pretty significant thing, just like an open marriage is a pretty significant thing. If you want children and your partner doesn't, or vice versa, compromising, that's a pretty big compromise if you feel really strongly about that. So that might be not something that you would compromise on, and you might decide that you need to move on from that relationship. But aside from those types of things, I think that if it's a relatively healthy relationship, and assuming that you actually love the other person, part of the work, part of what can make it hard at times, is navigating through that, having difficult conversations, finding a way to compromise, working on not taking things personally, being able to recognize how you show love to somebody may not be how they really need to experience being loved. And again, it doesn't make one person wrong or right, but in those kind of scenarios, I think it is important to be able to hear what is important to the other person. So for example, and I think I've talked about this a little bit, it took a while for my husband and I to get to this place. And it happened through having a lot of difficult conversations. But all of us have a way that we want to experience being loved, being cared for. And that can come from a lot of different places. And we naturally then tend to show our love and care for somebody in the similar way that we want to receive it. And oftentimes we're unaware that this is happening. We just act on it. And so when we're in relationship, we tend to do that. Well, what works for us, what we want, how we tend to express it may not be what the other person wants or tends to express it. And my husband and I were fairly different in that way without really recognizing it. And I would sometimes be hurt that he didn't get me a really beautiful card. Sometimes he wouldn't get me a card. Sometimes it would be a funny card. Because I felt like I couldn't express myself through writing very well, would spend hours looking for the perfect card. And he would get it, he'd open it, he'd read it, and he'd set it to the side. And that would be the end of it. And he would feel sometimes when he would give me a funny card and I wouldn't really laugh and I would feel hurt, even if I didn't say anything, he'd be like, what the hell? And I, on the other side, would feel hurt because clearly the hours I spent and all the cards I read trying to find just the perfect thing, and it didn't mean anything to him. So even though we never necessarily really expressed it, like we wouldn't necessarily get angry or anything like that, we might feel something and sometimes not even necessarily recognize exactly what it was we were feeling, but it would end up kind of showing up in some way. And then once we were able to really understand the difference there, instead of taking it personally, we were able to kind of navigate through that. And I stopped spending hours looking for cards, and I started appreciating funny cards because I didn't take it as a personal thing that he didn't actually care, because there were a lot of ways that he showed that he cared instead. But it took a long time for us to be able to really recognize that. And there are some things, for example, just being around one another, even if we're kind of doing separate things, is one way that he feels connected. For me, that actually felt very lonely. And so I didn't want to be around him if we weren't actually doing something together, spending time together. And he didn't understand that. And when I didn't want to be around him unless we were doing something together, he took that personally to mean that I didn't really enjoy being around him. Now, neither thing that we were thinking was true, but that's the meaning that we attached to it. And then we ended up believing that that was the reality. Once we started being able to have conversations around that, it no longer had the same impact. We weren't taking it personally any longer. And when we don't take things personally, we can actually begin to experience them very differently. So I no longer feel lonely or alone when we're in the same space together, but doing our own thing. But that wouldn't have happened if we didn't go through the process, the work, the hard work of being able to get there, because some of those conversations were difficult. They were vulnerable. They sometimes turned into arguments and disagreements. But over time, they became really beneficial and changed the nature of how we feel together in those types of circumstances. So even really healthy relationships, good relationships, are going to have times that you struggle. Life gets in the way. When your relationship, by the very nature of it, is vulnerable, all those stresses add to that vulnerability. So the difficulties and stressors in your life are likely going to impact your relationship in ways that might seem really obvious or maybe won't seem very obvious. But it takes work to become aware of that. And there is no relationship, no matter how good the relationship is, that doesn't require work, that doesn't on occasion have arguments. Relationships in which you never have a disagreement, never feel hurt or annoyed, it's likely because you're disconnected. And that's not healthy either. On the outside, it can look like a perfect relationship, but inside and within the context of the relationship, it's likely not. Even in very healthy relationships, there's going to be times that you disagree. There's going to be times that one person is more vulnerable for whatever reason and is likely going to take something more personally than they normally would. Or you might be more irritable and snap at somebody. And depending on the other person's level of vulnerability, they might snap right back. Or they might say, "Hey, what's going on? Everything okay?" There was a time that if my husband had said that to me, I wouldn't have taken it very well. And now I appreciate it. But it hasn't always been the case. But it got there because of the work that it took. So relationships that are meaningful take work. There's going to be times that you feel hurt. There's going to be annoyances. There's going to be frustrations. There's going to be misunderstandings. It's going to happen. And the more aware you are of your own stuff and how it shows up, how you interpret things, those ways of thinking like personalizing, catastrophizing, all of that, the more aware you are of that, the more beneficial it is in your relationship. And over time, the less likely all of those things are going to happen. And certainly the less impact they will have when they do. So thank you. There will be a link in the description to the video that I shared, that I stitched. So I talk about probably most of the things that I talked about in this video, but there will be links in the description for you to check out if you'd like to do so. So thank you for being here. I'd love to hear your thoughts, reflections in the comments. Again, I feel like I say this all the time, but if you haven't yet, subscribe, make sure to do so, and click the bell for notifications. If you found this helpful, give it a thumbs up. Thank you for being here. I'll look forward to seeing you next time.